Dirty gray streets, where the garbage runs, and from every corner a prostitute bends, who encourages us to use her services illness, hunger, and poverty. Houses that hardly hold on questionable foundations are built anywhere and anyhow. Children begging for support, men drunk and sleeping under the pub. It's not a post-apocalyptic picture, it's a 19th century London. And not all of it, because this city was full of contradictions and extremes at the time. On the one hand, a well-positioned aristocracy living in beautiful buildings surrounded by well-maintained gardens. But on the other hand, the same nobility closed its eyes to what it did not want to see, and it was that part of the city where we were looking in vain for wealth and glory. It was the East End, an unimaginable mess of slums, where no one with a better social status was going to show up. And, paradoxically, wealthy Londoners didn't look at this place until it was drowned in the blood of women when Jack the Ripper showed up. Peter Ackroyd wrote in his book on the capital of England that what gave East End its identity was a series of murders in the summer of 1888. The unexpected, violent killings have effectively marked this part of London with unparalleled violence and demoralization. The fact that the killer was never caught seems only to confirm the impression that the blood transfusion was done by the stinking streets themselves, that it was East End that was the real probator. Listen to a story that today has grown to the rank of a legend, and the murderer himself, although he has committed terrible crimes, is now in line with pop culture figures like Dracula or the Joker. It's a story of a psychopath, of mysteries, of fear, but also of social divisions that have forced the Queen herself to turn her eyes so low as she has never done before. Violence and murders in London in the 19th century were not extraordinary. There were violent attacks every day, very often targeted at women. In poor neighborhoods, most of them lived a miserable life, mostly concentrated around prostitution. They had no education, no position, no money. They didn't have anything to sell except their own bodies. They wandered around the dormitories and eventually rented a small room for a few people. They had to go to the streets to pay for him. If they didn't earn anything, they spent the next night in the open sky. If the worst London neighborhood had to be pointed out then, it would undoubtedly be Whitechapel, dominated by poverty and disease. Every corner could be the true source of evil. Arthur Morris in his book A Child of the Jago wrote, "There is nothing picturesque in such poverty. It is only a pathetic and uniform band of iniquity, filth, and poverty, dark basements, scattered attics, rooms with bare, covered walls, where diseases spread and death gathers its harvest. And where you won't be seen, even with the best of wills, even if there's a mark of decency. Poverty was so severe here that some buildings even lacked windows. Instead of them, sheets of material were hung, which were meant to protect against the cold. Another problem in this part of the city was gangs. They terrorized the poor Londoners by forcing money and often brutally beating them. They've been a problem all over the East End, but it's especially here that they showed themselves. One of the gang victims was Emma Elizabeth Smith, a widow and mother of 2 children who liked to look into a glass. She clothed herself at night and often came back with her eyes conquered. On the 3rd of April 1888, on her way home, she was attacked by several men. They beat her so hard that she got to the hospital. There, she was able to say that there were probably 3 assailants, and one looked like a teenager. Emma died the next day. Despite her earlier testimony, with time, suspicions emerged, especially among several police officers, that the woman was the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Today, this seems extremely unlikely. Not only do the insults disagree, but Emma's own words have denied it. The kill at first hit not April 3rd, but August 31st. It was Friday. Marian Nichols put on a hat she was so proud of, and she went out on the street to earn another day in the dormitory. She paid for pence for the room that she rented with 4 other women. Slightly inserted, smiling, she moved into the darkness and never got out of it again. That morning, some Charles Cross went out of the house to work. He was a driver. As he passed by the warehouses, on the other side of the street, at the gates leading to the stable next to the new cottage, his attention was drawn by a large object lying on the ground. Interested, he decided to come closer. Then he realized that what he was looking at was a woman's body. Right behind Charles, another random witness appeared. It was Robert Paul. He thought the woman was dead. The men decided to go their way and call the police on the way. But before they reached the officers themselves from the dark, one of them emerged. He was at the party. He lit a light and saw the body being massacred. He immediately noticed a large wound on his neck that was still bleeding. Next to it was an elegant cape, the one that Marion Nichols was happy to put on her head a moment ago. The woman's body went to the carpenter. It was only there that all the injuries could be fully examined. Mary had extensive, multilateral abdominal wounds. On one of his cheeks, there was a big bruise. There were the cuts in the throat. One was about 5 centimeters long, the other about 20. Both were pulled to the circle of the pillar, which was also pierced. It was established that all the wounds were struck with a wide but medium-sharp knife. According to the police, the perpetrator was holding the blade in his left hand and striking with enormous force. Death occurred immediately. Already then it was assumed that the killer had at least basic anatomical knowledge because he knew perfectly well which organs to put a knife in to kill the victim. The murders were committed in a maximum of 5 minutes. The murder of Marion Nichols has not escaped the attention of journalists. The events in Whitechapel were by the Times and the Star. They didn't spare enough brutal descriptions. The police had no doubts at the time. The murders were committed by one person, but some suspicions about the scene of the crime have already arisen. Still, this is a matter that still raises many questions. Some officers were convinced that the murders were carried out elsewhere than where the woman's body was found. To be honest, it was thrown into the backstroke. The murder was extremely difficult. It should be remembered that at that time police officers did not have practically any methods of investigating the crime scene that are common today. There were no witnesses, no evidence, except of course the massacred body. But that's all, so looking for the killer was like wandering in the fog. That doesn't mean the officers didn't have their suspects. The people were taken into account. One of them is a sailor, and the other is some kind of leather coat. This is a mysterious man who always wore a dark hat, and also a leather cap, hence this, and not another nickname. He always had a knife with him, and he was mainly involved in blackmailing women. But no one knew his name. The more attempts were made to confirm the theory that he was responsible for the murder of Marion Nichols, the more people treated him as a mythical figure. Everybody was talking about him, but nobody really saw him. Over time, this theory began to disappear. And then, for the second time, just a week after the brutal murder, the psychopath hit again. Annie Chapman was a woman approaching her 50. For a dozen years, she was married to John Chapman, a driver with whom she had 3 children. Unfortunately, motherhood was full of great suffering for Anna. The son was a calf, and one of the daughters died of meningitis. Shortly thereafter, a similar fate encountered another girl. The marriage didn't survive this trial. In addition, Annie abused alcohol and led a lifestyle that in those days also affected her husband's work. Since he was employed by representatives of the aristocracy, his wife's prosperous social life also reflected on his reputation. After her divorce from her husband, Annie received alimony from John. She also started dating another man with whom she lived in the dormitory. She took on various activities. She used to sell flowers and matches. But it wasn't something that would bring her enough money. She also often went to the hospital. It's because of pneumonia and meningitis. Despite her weakness, she didn't leave the pubs, and so was the night she met a killer on her way. On September 8, 1888, after 5 o'clock in the morning, Elizabeth Long was walking through Humbert Street when she saw a man talking to a woman on the sidewalk. As she later testified, the stranger looked like a stranger to her. He was about 40 years old, in a dark coat and a small hunting hat, and he was a little taller than the woman he stood by. She heard him say it, "Would you?" That's what the companion said, yes. She later told the police it was Annie Chapman. A few minutes later, her body was found by John Davis. Chapman's body lay between one of the houses and the fence. Davis alerted people from the neighborhood, shouting that I think a woman was killed. Several people ran to the scene, and then one of them ran for the police. It was James Kent, who didn't find any officers nearby. So the man entered the pub, drank alcohol there, and went back to the crime scene, where he covered the body with a piece of gift. The next person who ran to call the police was Henry John Holland. It is true that he met one officer, but he was driving the traffic and did not go to the places indicated by Ller. He filed a complaint at the police station the same day. Today, it seems almost absurd to think about the fact that the place of murder could not have been brought to the police. But in 19th century London, solving such cases, especially if they concerned slums, was not a priority. Annie Chapman was only interested in the fate of the inspector at Commercial Street. He went to the scene, and then he sent a surgeon. The woman's body was transported to the barracks, and there, after inspections, it was determined that both Marion Nichols and Annie Chapman were murdered by the same person. The wounds on the body of the second victim testified to this. The woman was first strangled, then her throat was cut off. The cut was so deep and extensive that it reached the spine. It looked like the killer was trying to cut off her head. Above the right arm were thin intestines, which had not yet been completely removed. The stomach was literally spread out. In addition, 2/3 of the bladder, the upper part of the vagina, and the entire uterus were cut off. And the suggestion was the same again as with the first sacrifice. The perpetrator must have known the basics of anatomy. He used a thin, narrow blade, a scalpel. The news of another brutal murder quickly reached the media. These, of course, described the crime scene and Chapman's body very floridly. This, in turn, caused panic among the poor Whitechapel residents. But in turn, the wealthier people started to be interested in what was going on in this part of London. Their fascination was so great that in the courtyard, where the body of the woman was found, literally, excursions of gaps began to appear. People paid to be able to come in and see the place where such a brutal murder was committed. The police had to get past the gap. At the same time, police were scouring nearby dormitories in the hope of finding bloody clothes that could point to the suspect. But no one like that has ever been found. Again, there was a theory about the mysterious leather coat. But this version more and more often began to be accompanied by a kneeling laugh. Instead, the suspicion that the killer is someone from the higher spheres has begun to emerge. One of the figures who spread this theory was L. Forbes Winslow, an expert on mental illness. On the 11th of September, he wrote such an opinion. I think the killer does not belong to the social class to which the leather coat belongs, but to the highest segments of society. And I am still convinced that the opinion I presented to the authorities is the right one. That means that the murder was committed by a crazy man who had just been released from the crazy plant, or one who escaped from there. If the first, it is undoubtedly a man who, despite suffering from the mania of killing, appears to be healthy and has therefore been released. And now, following the voice of his macabre imagination, he kills with I think my advice is logical. Managed from all the insane stores that have released such individuals, and who, I hope, know where they are, to order their immediate return. The police followed this advice and started checking several places where such persons could be. Several of them were even arrested, but none were linked to the murders. Every day no one suspected of murder in the East End was arrested, and Scotland Yard became more and more depressed. The officials were under enormous social pressure, which was further driven by the newspapers. Journalists accused the police of incompetence, helplessness, and even stupidity. A wave of criticism also spilled over the Minister of the Interior, who was subject to the police. The articles began to include analyses of the entire society in the East End. It has begun to point out the lawlessness, poverty, and diseases, but also the spread of prostitution, including among children. Often, girls between the ages of 10 and 14 were used for this. Such crimes against children have even become a subject of debate among politicians and have appeared in special laws to ban these practices. The Times wrote at the time, "The Whitechapel horror will not go us in vain if the public consciousness finally wakes up and realizes what this horror has revealed. Murders, you might say, had to happen, where a generation, one after another, lives in iniquity. Where babies from the cradle are beaten up with dishonesty. Where the criminal community does not create social ties. There can't be order, peace, and order." The press also demanded the establishment of a civil guard. On the 10th of September, a dozen merchants decided to form such an association. Other trade groups have done the same. At the end of September, Coroner Weinboxter presented the conclusions he had drawn from the bodies of the victims. He announced that the killer was someone who knew the anatomy of a human being, and no wound was accidental. What's more, it must have been someone who had experience, like the prosecutor, and killed because he needed organs. That is why some organs were missing from the victims' bodies. According to Baxter, the perpetrator traded them. It was supposed to be a very profitable business because a certain American wanted to buy from the pathology museum for a few months. He offered £20 for each, what the coroner said seemed to the press and the public a logical explanation. People even started making their own theories about how to catch a killer when he was probably someone with a medical education. They flooded the police with letters with their own suggestions and scenarios, but none of these writings were useful. For this, the officials and the whole society were soon to be shocked by further violent crimes. Elizabeth Strite, called by some the Lon Liz, was born in Sweden, where she also started working as a cleaner. Later, by mistake, she was placed in the police prostitute register. It was deleted from the register the same year. It's because of Mary Weissner, who secured a woman and took her home for her service. The only problem is that Mary was probably the owner of the public house. Shortly thereafter, Liz's mother died, leaving her a small legacy. That allowed her to go to London. That's when she got back on duty. 3 years later, she married John Thomas Strite. The couple allegedly had 9 children. When the marriage broke up a few years later, Elizabeth claimed that both her husband and children were killed in the Princess Alice steamplane crash. The truth, however, was that Liz liked to drink, and John died 3 years after the breakup, not as a result of the ship's sinking. Nor was it confirmed that the woman had any children. Elizabeth was arrested several times by the police for causing drunken adventures. She also entered into a rather turbulent romance, which eventually ended in quarrels and separation. After another adventure on September 27th, the woman landed in the dormitory. She made money cleaning up the Jews. 2 days later, after work, she went to the pub. It was Saturday. For Liz, it's the last time in her life. The woman's body was found in the entrance to the courtyard of the house on Berner Street. Interestingly, this was the place where the headquarters of the International Educational Association of Workers was located. There was also a printing house and the editorial office of the socialist newspaper Arbeiter Front, which was founded by the Jewish radical Morris Vinchevsky. Every weekend there were meetings with Russian, Jewish, Polish, Czech, British, French, or Italian participants. They all had quite radical views. On the 29th of September, just next to the assassination of Elizabeth Strite, a similar international meeting was also held on Berner Street 40. There were about 100 people there. The discussion on why Jews should be socialists ended around 23. Most people left the building, but about 30 members of the association remained on site. The previous hot conversation turned into a play of dancing and singing. This may explain why no one heard any screams. About 1 a.m., Louis Dimstitz, who was the manager of the building on Berner Street, was coming home. He was driving a van that he was going to leave to the stable at George Hurd. At some point, he felt that his head become bald and began to pull the wagon to the left. He was convinced it was because of the uneven ground. In the dark, it looked like someone threw mud on the road. He got out of the car, lit a light, and then saw that it wasn't an inequality. It was a woman's body. It was Elizabeth Strite. She had her throat cut. There were a lot of bruises on her shoulders. According to forensic doctors, the killer just caught her by the shoulders, threw her to the ground, and then cut her throat, heading from left to right. And these were actually the only injuries that were found on the woman's body. In terms of distribution, they were therefore, to put it plainly, extremely sensitive. There are the theories here. Either Elizabeth wasn't his victim, or he didn't finish his crime. Somebody could have stopped him, and he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Liz dead. One of the most important witnesses to this crime was Israel Schwartz. He convinced me that he saw a man talking to a woman that night, and then he tried to pull her out of the street. But as she resisted, he grabbed her and threw her to the ground. At the same time, there was a second man standing nearby, who lit the pipe. He called for the first to Leipzig. Then he saw Schwartz. He started following him. Israel fled and stopped a little further. He accurately described the two men to the police, and in the woman who was shot to the ground, he recognized Elizabeth Strike killed. Why did one of the men yell at Leipzig? As the police explained, a year earlier, a certain Jew was hanged for killing a Jewish woman. His name was Leipzig. When someone wanted to insult a person of Jewish descent, he called her by that very name. He was a very valuable witness to the police. His testimony was consistent and, moreover, partly coincided with the versions presented by several others. The man was also interrogated behind closed doors and his version was not made public. Nevertheless, nothing more has been drawn from this story. The men that Israel was talking about have not been found and the solution to this nightmare puzzle has not been approached. Worse, the night Elizabeth was killed had another macabre surprise. Catherine Eddowes was born on April 14, 1842. Actually, she lived in London all her life. She had 10 siblings. After the death of her parents, she was taken to a shelter. When she grew up, she started dating Tom Conway. She had 3 children with him. It was a turbulent relationship, mainly because of Catherine's alcoholism and explosive character. Sometimes she disappeared for 2 or 3 months, and then, as if nothing, she went home. Her relationship with Thomas eventually broke up in 1881. Probably in the same year, the woman was taken to the shelter. She was tied up there with another man. She also tried every minute for adventure and vulgar language. Her own children also cut contact with her. And that's because she forced money from them, and also stole it. At the end of September, according to her partner's testimony, Kate wanted to get to her daughter Annie. She was going to take her money because she had nothing with her. She and her partner broke up at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and promised to be back soon. What happened to her later is not entirely clear. It's known that she drank a lot. One of the cops found her impotent and together with a colleague they brought the woman to the station. At about 1 a.m. when she was a little sober, she was released from her cell. Eddowes went out and said, "I'm gonna get a bunch of linen, so I'll just go home." After the first hour, at least 3 people saw Eddowes with a man. His description coincided in a few points with what Israel Schwartz said earlier describing with companion Elizabeth Strike. It was supposed to be a skinny, pale man in bad clothes, but it was a running description, not very accurate. In turn, not all witnesses could say with 100% certainty that it was Eddowes who stood with a mysterious stranger. It was seen mainly from the back and could only be recognized by the clothes, and that does not mean anything yet. At the first 45, her body was found. It was in one of the corners of Meter Square. It was completely massacred. She had wounds around her eyes, nose, and mouth. A piece of her ear and nose were cut off. The intestines were removed and transferred to the right shoulder. The killer also cut off the right kidney and a piece of the uterus. Both of those parts disappeared. And again, according to experts, the perpetrator proved to have an excellent knowledge of human anatomy. The cuts were precise and thoughtful. Meanwhile, a little further away, near Goulston Street, one of the cops found a piece of a suit. It was bloody and, as it turned out, it belonged to Kate. On the wall next to it was an inscription that the Jews are a nation that will not be blamed for anything. It is difficult today to say what the author meant, but the officials considered that he may have fueled anti-Semitic moods. That's why it was ordered to be washed, After the news of two murders in one night spread throughout London, panic broke out in the city. Thousands of people gathered at the sites where Liz and Kate's bodies were found. The police had to intervene. There have also been some speculations about what happened last night. The version that seemed most likely sounded like this. The killer attacked Elizabeth first. He managed to overthrow her and kill her, but he didn't finish his work because someone came out of the darkness. This made the murderer, who ran away abandoning the victim's body, empty. However, he was angry that he was interrupted and did not intend to stop taking the life of one person. Then on his way he met Catherine, where he discharged all his frustration. This was attested by violent facial injuries that looked like they were blinded. But no matter what directed him that night, he managed to bring about chaos in the city, and frightened women began to write letters to the Queen herself. It had to intervene personally and ask for an urgent explanation of these macabre crimes. And what's worse, it's not over yet. Interestingly, before the double murder on September 27th, Central News received a letter and it sounded like this. Dear boss, I still hear that the police have caught me, but he hasn't locked me up yet. I laugh when they look so smart and talk about being on the right track. This joke about the leather coat really made me fun. I don't digest whores and I'll kill them until I'm locked up. The last job was a great job. I didn't give the lady time. How can they catch me now? I love my job and I want to start over. You'll soon hear about me and my little tricks. I left some suitable red substance in a bottle of ginger beer after the last job to write it, but it was thickened like glue, so I couldn't use it. I hope the red ink fits well enough. Next time I work, I'm gonna whip the lady's ears and send it to the police. It's for fun. Hold this letter until I do a little more. Get him out later. My knife is so nice and sharp, and I want to give it a job whenever I have the opportunity. Good luck. I greet you. Jack the Ripper. P.S. Not a very good idea was to send this before I wash the red ink off my hands, and let it be unlucky for now. Now they say I'm a doctor. It was then that the nickname Jack the Ripper first appeared. The initial agency thought it was a bad joke, but later it sent the letter to Scotland Yard. He was pulled out again when the bodies of Edus were found because according to the announcement the present will give ears. Indeed, Kate had a partially cut ear. On October 1st, a postcard arrived at the agency. It's written on it I wasn't kidding, dear old boss, when I gave you a hint. Tomorrow you'll hear about the work of the Ugly Jack, about a double event. This time, number one was a little crazy and I couldn't finish. I didn't have time to grab the promised police ears. Thank you for keeping the last letter until I get back to work, Jack the Ripper. And here again, some of the information on the postcard coincided with what happened that bloody night. Israel Schwartz testified that the woman who was attacked in front of his eyes shouted, but not very loudly. Messages from the killer were partly published in the newspapers in the hope that someone would recognize the character of the writing. Theoretically, however, a good move turned out to be disastrous. The editorials were literally flooded with hundreds of letters from people who thought it was the perfect spot for jokes. There are even theories that the letters from the alleged killer were sent by the journalists themselves. Almost all such shipments were treated as jokes by the police and were not given much importance to them. But on October 16th, a letter was sent to the chairman of the Civil Guard, George Lask. It was called from hell. To Mr. Lask, I'm sending you half a kidney. I took it from one woman. I kept it for you. I baked another piece and ate it. It was delicious. I can send you the crooked knife that I took out. Well, you just wait a little longer. Catch me if you can, Mr. Lask. After examining the shipment, it turned out that it was actually a human kidney. The letter that was attached to it was the only one not signed by Jack the Ripper. Most researchers today agree that both a letter from hell and a postcard with the rude Jack, as well as a letter entitled Dear Boss, are probably messages just written by a serial killer. On the murders of Liz and Kate, the killer didn't intend to finish his bloody opera. It was heard again in November 1888. Her main character was Mary Jane Kelly. She was the youngest of the sadist victims. She was only 25 years old. She was born in Ireland. According to people who knew her, she was an exceptionally attractive girl. She married a miner who died in an accident shortly after her marriage. Kelly, deprived of any means of living, lived with her cousin and under her influence began to prostitute. She changed her place of residence every minute, and she also liked to drink. She lived in a one-room apartment with a night table, a chair, a fireplace, a closet, and a bed. On the evening of November 8th, Mary went to meet her friend. They both went to the pub. The girl after some time left there, and already in the next room she was seen with a young man with dark beards. After 23, Kelly saw Marion Cox, a prostitute. As she testified, the girl was completely drunk and was accompanied by another man. He was about 35 years old. He was rainbow, and he had a melon and lush red mustache. Kelly was in a good mood. She even started singing. She was later seen around Flower and Dean Street. She was talking to a man, and then laughing. She went with him towards Dorset Street. According to one witness, the stranger who disappeared with Kelly looked like a Jew. Besides, he had a soft, fleece-shaped hat, bent deep into his eyes, thick, upward-twisted mustaches, and bushy eyebrows. He was wearing a dark coat, underneath which was a white shirt and tie. He was about 36 years old. According to some investigators, it could have been Kelly's killer. At about 4 a.m., one of the neighbors was awakened by a single scream coming from Mary's apartment. But she ignored it and went to sleep. Before 11 a.m., Thomas Boyer knocked at the girl's apartment, who came to remind her of the rent. But the silence answered him. Still, he opened the door and went inside. What he saw totally frightened him. In the massacred body lying on the bed, it was difficult to recognize a human being at all. Thomas ran for help. Immediately the police arrived and closed the whole area. Today we can find a picture that depicts the macabre that happened in Mary's apartment. Dr. Thomas Bond made this description of the bodies. They were naked. They lay flat in the middle of the bed, but the body axis turned to the left edge. The head was twisted to the left cheek. The left arm rested close to the body. The forearm, bent at a straight angle, lay on the abdomen. The right arm was slightly visited from the body and lay on the mattress, bent at the elbow. The forearm is flat, the fingers tight, the legs wide open. The left thigh is at a straight angle in relation to the trunk. The right formed an open angle with the womb. The entire surface of the abdomen and thighs was covered with skin, and the abdominal cavity was deprived of intestines. Breasts cut, arms shattered by a few sharp wounds, face cut unrecognizable, neck tissues cut to bone. The intestines were located in different places, namely the uterus, the kidneys, one of the breasts under the head, the other breast next to the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestine on the right side of the body, the spleen on the left. Skin strips removed from the abdomen and thighs lay on the table. The bed linen in the right corner of the bed was filled with blood, and on the floor below there was a 2-square-foot-sized blood bowl. The wall on the right side of the bed and at the height of the neck was marked with stripes of blood. Further in the description, the killer was shown to have partially removed his nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears. Kelly had a cut off of the airway. Her chest was opened and one lung was partially removed. Her heart was removed. Actually, every part of the girl's body was severely damaged. According to the doctor, the murder occurred around 2 p.m. This crime was slightly different from the previous ones. Above all, the first time it was done not on the street, but at home. Besides, according to the doctor, the perpetrator had no anatomical knowledge, as he stressed, even a butcher. But contemporary researchers, who are convinced that Kelly was the 5th and last victim of Jack the Ripper, disagree with this. Was she killed by the mysterious man in the lush beard she was walking with that night? Maybe, but there are so many theories about the distribution of identity that it is hard to accept any version for certain. The sad irony behind this is that it was Mary who became one of the martyr's victims. As one of her friends said, there was no woman throughout Whitechapel who would be more afraid of Jack the Ripper than Mary Kelly. The murder of a girl ended a bloody series of violent crimes that shook Victorian London. But that does not mean that today, more than 130 years after those events, they are no longer exciting. Researchers from all over the world are competing in theories about the killer's identity. We don't know why he suddenly stopped killing. Maybe he died himself or went to jail. It seems unlikely that the killing, in which he was increasingly brutal, suddenly ceased to please him. Among the suspects for all these years were M.J. Druda, a doctor who was allegedly a sexual maniac, as well as Aaron Komofsky, a Polish Jew who lived near the places where the crimes were committed. As indicated, he hated women, showed strong murder tendencies, and was also in a mental health facility. The list also included Michael Ostrich, a Russian physician, as well as George Chapman, in fact Søren Kolosovsky, also a Polish, who was a surgeon. He was proven to be tricked by 3 women, for which he was hanged. According to some theories, the assassinations were even carried out by the royal family or a high-ranking aristocracy, and all the crimes were supposed to have a much broader political dimension. In 2014, sensational news circulated around the world. Jack the Ripper was meant to be mentioned by Aaron Komofsky. DNA tests were supposed to confirm this. The samples were taken from one of the victim's scales. When these reports came to light, I wrote a text for one of the news portals. Then, a little under the current, I realized that it was unlikely that we could now be able to identify with 100% certainty who the killer really was. Most of the theories are only theories, not supported by any evidence. It's hard to have them if they were killed in the 19th century. A few months after my text, there was more information. This time from a group of researchers who challenged DNA results. And we're back at the starting point again. The identity of the killer may remain one of the most loud, unresolved riddles ever. This further arouses interest in this story and makes us look less and less at it as the course of real events, and more often we see it as a myth, a legend. While the names Ed Kemper or David Berkowitz are known to people interested in criminal topics, already the pseudonym Jack the Ripper is associated with virtually everyone. Victorian scenery, night, fear, dirt, helpless prostitutes, and evil lying in the dark. All this means that we read and listen to the events of 1888 not with horror, but with a fervent interest, which is fueled from time to time by no sensational reports. Like, share, subscribe for more.